panel. Of course, I missed saying hello to Shirley, but I have been listening to the entire session since you began, and I was left to wonder why why am I needed? Why am I needed on the forum? Because Corey has dealt so amicably with so much. And for those who may not be aware of it, Corey is not just an attorney at law, he's also a minister of the gospel. And congratulations, Corey, to your ascent to that position.
Thank you.
But you are equally capable of expressing the spiritual components of these things. There are a number of aspects, Marcy, if I could address that have to do with this entire matter of the separation of church and state. The first thing I want to draw your attention to, because as I have been listening, there has been a lot of focus in your presentation on the charter. And I think it's important for people to recognize, during the time I have taken time to look through a myriad of definitions of the charter, to discover that the charter actually is a foundational policy or principle, or it's what you dig out when you're building a house. Mm-hmm. You excavate the foundation, you lay in your marl fill, and then you pour your slab, and then you begin to build on it. And in a sense, the charter represents that aspect upon which you are now going to build up the rest of the country's policies, laws, etc.
Correct.
And it's interesting in looking at the charter in the context of what we are currently addressing, the matter of the separation of church and state. And I want to read for you what Article 3 starts off by saying. Every Barbadian has a duty to participate in the economic, political, and social life of Barbados as an expression of active citizenship. Every Barbadian has the right to vote and run for public office in accordance with the laws of this country. So that in essence, nobody, regardless of their religious persuasion or non-religious persuasion, can be denied access to the political, social, economic development of Barbados. Nobody. Unless there are laws introduced into the Constitution that specifically address who can be denied or who can be accepted. And I believe Mr. Beckles would confer with me on that. And so, to my mind, the charter, while people are saying it's not law, while I hear expressions concerning the fact that it's not law, I believe, Corey, you mentioned it had gone through the process of Parliament and it had gone through the process of Senate. I think people need to understand that once any matter transitions through those two houses of our country, mm-hmm. that they are to be taken very seriously. Mm-hmm. It's not the case. I think I'd heard something, Corey, because we are on a forum before. We had heard some mention of the fact that it cannot be used in terms of a reference point or something of that matter as it relates to legal challenges and so forth. But I think people need to understand when something is contained within the official Gazette of Parliament, that is a very serious matter. Very, very serious matter. And we need to recognize that. So let's start there. The second thing I'd like to mention is that people need to be aware of how intrinsically critical the contribution of the church has been to the development of our societies on a whole. If you were to look back a little bit at the history of the church, you would discover that the church was at the forefront of the whole aspect of the value of human life. The church resisted significantly after its birth and implementation. It resisted significantly all of the sports in the Roman Colosseums and so on, to the point where the emperor blamed the church for the decline in the economic prosperity of Rome because it had such an influence and impact that the gladiatorial and Colosseum games were literally being affected, and the revenues being generated were literally being affected because the church brought a value to human life. Again, I think there is need, as Corey has alluded to define what church is. Mm-hmm. Very often, we put down church to the denominational groupings or organizational groupings. The architect of the church is neither the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Pentecostals, or any organization. The architect of the church is Jesus Christ, and he has not left that up to any single individual on the face of the earth to deal with and construct. He said he would build his church. And when you look at the original definition or meaning of the Greek word used there, I found it very interesting because it just doesn't reflect on people called out. Very often, when we have used the expression ecclesia, we have just referred to people called out. But it means much more than that. It also means a legislative assembly or persons who are selected. It was never a religious expression. It has always been a political and governmental term used in classical group Greek for a group of people who have been summoned and gathered together to govern the affairs of a city. That is the meaning of ecclesia. It does not have a religious setting. It has a political and a governmental setting. So for persons who are ignorant as to what the definition of the church is, that should set clearly in your mind that you cannot separate the church and the state, because the people form the state and the people form the church. And it is the people who implement governmental and political policy. The church has also been at the forefront of the matter of sexual morality. This is why today, if a person abuses their wife, a person can be charged for committing rape with their wife. And I'm sure Corey can confirm this with me again, confirm this for me again. Even though you're a husband, you cannot take sexual advantage over your wife, even though she's your wife. If your wife says no and you force sexual involvement with her, she can take you to court for rape. So that the church has been contributory to the morality of a society, significantly so. It has also been contributory to the charity and compassion. We have offices of government today dealing with matters to do with the societal, the care of people in our society. We have organizations like the Child Care Board, which the laws regulating the treatment of children have emerged out of our biblical basis. Then you have matters to do with things like modern science. I don't know how many people realize that the initial idea that the world was round did not emerge from science. There was a man who read the Bible and discovered that the scripture spoke about how the Lord sits upon the circle of the earth. And as a result of that, began to explore and examine the reality, because at one time we would have known from our history that people thought that the world was flat and that if you went too far, you would fall off the edge. I mean, that was a reality. But the church brought real science to the equation. And then you also had the aspects of law, which I'm sure, again, Corey is so familiar with. And these are all things that the church has been extremely contributory to within the context of its society. I'd also like to make the point, in just closing off this brief contribution to you, that not only in terms of what I've reflected on here, but in terms of persons' involvement, we have often heard it said, "Come ye out from among them and be ye separate, and touch not the unclean thing, saith the Lord, and I will receive you unto myself." As a result of that, the church as an organizational philosophy has withdrawn itself from involvement in many societal matters, which, had it not done that, maybe we would be in a different position today. There's a saying, I am sure you would recall, Marcia, that the only thing that is necessary for evil men to triumph is for good men to remain silent. And as a result of this, and I also want to make the point, for those people who think that I'm propagating a sacrilegious thought in terms of opposing that philosophy, Jesus himself prayed in John's Gospel, chapter 17, straight from the horse's mouth. And I often ask, how many times does Jesus have to say something for it to be law? I can understand Paul and I can understand Peter, James, and John having to say something 2 or 3 times. But when it comes to Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, he only has to say it once. And in his high priestly prayer, he prayed, I pray that you do not take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. So I really want to encourage people not to back away. We are at a critical juncture in our country, very critical. The Prime Minister has indicated the intention of engaging the society on a whole from January to December of next year. And I believe it is the obligation of every single citizen in this country, regardless of their political persuasion, religious persuasion, or non-religious persuasion, or whatever it is, to contribute and let their voices be heard, as the Prime Minister has invited every member of our society to contribute to the discussions on the Constitution.
Yes.
But it is clear what the articles of the Charter as the foundation is beginning to outline. I believe it was either 2020 or 2019, just about a year or 2 years ago, pertaining to the legislative aspect of the marriage rights for LGBTQ individuals, where I think it was the Chief Justice or one of the senior judges ruled in favor of a couple that wanted to be married in the Cayman Islands, ruled in favor. It was challenged. And the challenge was upheld because it had not been established through the Legislative Assembly of the Cayman Islands, which, of course, subsequent to that, it was taken to the Legislative Assembly, and the Legislative Assembly narrowly passed it, and as a result, has now been implemented as law in the Cayman Islands. Right. I find that very often, with greatest respect to our judges and magistrates and so on, that we are having legislative authorities implementing laws that have not been passed through Parliament. And as such, it should be and can be challenged, because we cannot have a law either interpreted or expressed in a legal framework by any court that has not been clearly outlined in the Parliament and Senate of our country as it currently stands. That is why persons can challenge the result or the order or result of a magistrate or judge on the basis of their interpretation. The same thing happens in terms of customs. When you bring things into the country, it is often thought that customs have the right to interpret. But in truth and in fact, if you look at the Customs Act, there are specific references in the Customs Act that customs officers are required to follow. And when persons who are au fait to those type of legislative positions are aware of it, they reserve the right to challenge it, and more often than not, is successful. So, there are a number of things that I could reference, Marcia, but one of the challenges that the church has faced down through the years is the divisive nature of denominational groupings. And it has emerged very often from spiritual leaders not having the intestinal fortitude to take strong stands on positions. And let me illustrate what I mean. There's this idea that the Christian God is accommodating of all other gods or faiths. I want to put it to you that any casual reader of the Bible could never come to that conclusion. God has always made it very clear that there's a massive separation between, Hear Israel, the Lord thy God is one God, and all the others. I recently heard in one of the Republic celebration events, a minister of religion referencing a couple of things, a number of things which I felt was very disingenuous of him, not to mention the contribution that the evangelical organizations of our country have made to the landscape of Barbados. He mentioned one or two of the others. And I want to be very, very clear. If a person has a problem as a preacher, father, reverend, bishop, archbishop, whatever name you want to call yourself by, if that person has a problem with the uniqueness and sovereignty of the God that we serve, you need to find another religion to be a part of that accommodates that perspective. But Christianity does not. Jesus Christ is very clear, very, very clear. You see, we like to talk about philosophy, and we like to talk about things that don't necessarily engender division. But Jesus Christ is a divider. There's no question about this. We can sit here all day long and we could have a wonderful discussion about God and there'll be no problem. But the moment we introduce Jesus Christ, it becomes a problem. Jesus himself says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. The Apostle Peter, I think it is, reaffirms that in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, and he says, neither is there any other name given under heaven whereby we must be saved. We need to understand that Christianity is God coming down to mankind, not mankind trying to acquire divinity. But this has been from the beginning of creation. It has always been God's intention to come down. We always see him coming down, coming down, coming down. Jesus took on himself the form of a servant, came down. You find God coming down in Genesis chapter 2, coming down to fellowship with man in the garden. So the first thing we need to recognize is that there are things that have divided us. But what are the things that unite us? What are the things that bring us together? And I want to propose that when we look at matters of morality, which Mr. Colin Jordan has indicated, and I can't believe, with due respect to him as minister and in the House of Assembly, and I know Colin, and I know several of the members in the government, and I have tremendous respect for them. But it boggles my mind how anyone sitting in Parliament could even suggest that government has no right legislating morality. But the mere fact that I have to stop at a red traffic light and I cannot break it is a moral decision. The mere fact that I cannot walk into the supermarket, pick up the goods because I'm seeing hard times and walk out is a moral decision. And those are contained within the laws of Barbados. I cannot steal and get away with it. I cannot break the red light and get away with it. I cannot park in a no parking zone and get away with it. I mean, these are the things that Parliament establishes. So if the church is going to be contributory to the development going forward, I believe there's a need for us to be able to sit down, not simply as spiritual leaders, but as a diocese. And when I speak of a diocese, and I'm not speaking of just surrounding my particular assembly, I see my diocese as my country, Barbados. And I hope Corey sees it that way, even though he's a member of a different denominational grouping. I see my diocese as a part of Barbados. So I believe, especially with persons like Corey, because he did mention something which I think is important. I am not a medical expert. I am not a legal expert. My mother would tell me that I am a jack of all trades and a master of none, is probably how she would best describe me. But I believe that we need now to sit down, first of all, and be educated by persons such as Corey. And maybe it is important for the Christian leadership to suck its pride up and humble itself and allow persons such as Corey, other attorneys that deal with other aspects of constitutional law and so on, because he is correct. The Constitution is a legal document. It's not a spiritual one. Barbados is not a theocracy. It's not God's intention to have a theocracy established upon the earth right now by humanity. He's going to do that when he's ready, all by himself. But I think it would be good for us to sit and listen to some of the experts in terms of this pandemic, for example. I'm not a medical professional, but I have sat at the feet of the experts and listened to what they've had to say, and subsequently have adapted particular positions relative to the pandemic and the vaccines and COVID-19 and so on. Because we need to learn. You have said that this event here today is an educational one, and my goodness, how we have learned. You know, I sat in amazement listening to what's her name, Shirley from Jamaica, yes. and listening to Corey, because this is what the Republic Constitution and articles are about. It is not about David and Goliath. While there is an aspect of that, it's not about healing. It's about how we understand the relationship between our faith and the legalities of matters that are coming in to our society. And I want to remind us as I close this aspect, that righteousness and justice are the foundations of God's throne. So what God wants are Christians who don't have their heads so high stuck in the sky concerning spirituality that they are of no fundamental earthly use. We as Christians have a responsibility to fight for and defend the rights of people to freedoms of all kinds, because the scripture tells us that when Jesus Christ sets you free, you are free indeed. And I want to remind everyone on this forum and those who may tune in the future that it is Christianity spread across the world that has brought the freedoms and liberties to every single society that it has impacted. Yes, There have been those who have used it through the slave trade and other means to justify their superiority. That is not Jesus's perspective. They are not representing him. But wherever you go upon the face of the earth, whether it be South America, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, even in China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Jakarta, Singapore, every part of the world that has been exposed to Christianity, we see a development of the society. And I believe we need to be able to allow our faith to influence what is happening, and for people like Corey to come and sit down with us as spiritual leaders.
Yes.
Teach us the aspects of this, and then allow maybe persons like himself to speak to our congregants and educate them in the context of this.
Yeah.
Marcia, just let me say that we in Barbados need to recognize that our parliamentary representatives are exactly that. They are our parliamentary representatives. They're supposed to communicate in Parliament what the people in a constituency feel. It means that as a people, when there are constituency branch meetings, we need to turn up and require of our parliamentary representatives to represent in Parliament what we feel. When persons stood and took a pledge of allegiance to Barbados, I believe it was Saturday. And this is the case whenever whenever an election is over and political members are elected to office, they take a pledge to be the servants of the people. And no sooner are they in office before they demonstrate that they're not servants, but they're masters. And people need to be reminded that the place, if you want your voice to be heard, is in your constituency office, because we need to understand that politicians only understand one thing: the vote. That is what they understand.
Correct.
And that is why the vote is so powerful, because if you come into the constituency office, express my situation or my position, and you go into Parliament to say something else, the next time you come around for my vote, I will not be giving you my vote. It is as simple as that. The second thing we need to pay attention to, and I'm going to call everybody in Barbados' attention to it, is the Equality Act in the United States of America. It is accessible online. You need to read it, because it will form the basis of much of what is being introduced across the face of the earth. Let me illustrate just a couple of things, Marcia, before I go, pertaining to the Equality Act, because it will impact every single religious individual or non-religious individual. For example, it requires all charities and adoption agencies, including those of a religious nature, not to practice sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in their hiring and in their distribution of services. To do so will cause you to lose your charitable status. It will exclude from all political, corporate, academic, professional, and judicial hiring and appointments anyone who's not a cheerleader for all things gay and transgender. These are just a couple of the things that are contained within the Equality Act that forms the basis of what a lot of the world is going to be looking to implement in terms of their legislative. Because remember what our Governor General, now President, said: the world has spoken. The world has established this particular position, and Barbados has to comply. I don't feel so. I believe we are a sovereign country. We had a leader that said we will be friends of all and satellites of none. With due respect to all the United Nations positions, we run the affairs of Barbados, and nobody has a right to tell us what to do, not even in this pandemic. Nobody has a right to tell us what to do. And worse now that we're a republic, because now we're a republic, England cannot tell us anything, cannot impose their will or purposes upon us. And fundamentally, we are now saying we are truly a sovereign state. Well, if that's the case, Barbados needs to establish for itself what is going to be its pathway forward. And I really want to encourage every single Barbadian to get involved in this whole process, because this is what is going to impact our children, our children's children, and our children's children's children in generations to come.